She's been lying to all of us, my brother said, his voice perfectly steady. She's been hiding money, manipulating the estate, and frankly I'm worried about her mental state. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He was looking at the mediator, at the family lawyer, at my aunt who had driven 3 hours from Sudbury to sit in that conference room and nod along like she already knew the verdict. I checked the clock on the wall. 9:47 a.m. I had been awake since 4. Not from anxiety, from preparation. Have you ever sat in a room full of people who love you and realized they had already decided you were the villain before you opened your mouth? Drop a yes in the comments if you know that feeling. I want to know how many of us have been there. My brother, I'll call him my brother because that's all he is to me now, not a person, had arranged everything beautifully. The estate lawyer, a man named Mr. Cassidy who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and wore a watch that cost more than my first car, sat at the head of the table. My aunt, my mother's sister, dabbed at the corner of her eye, with a tissue she had clearly prepared in advance. My brother's wife sat slightly behind him, not quite at the table, like she was the director watching the performance from the wings. And then there was me, 31 years old, HGTV blazer from Value Village, transit pass in my coat pocket, a single manila folder on the table in front of me. My brother had told everyone I was unraveling, that grief had broken me after our mother's death 14 months ago, that I had made impulsive financial decisions with the estate, that I had, in his words, basically let hundreds of thousands of dollars disappear without saying a word to anyone. He wasn't entirely wrong about the money disappearing. He was catastrophically wrong about why. Mr. Cassidy cleared his throat. Your brother has raised some serious concerns regarding the management of your late mother's estate, specifically the registered investment accounts and the proceeds from the sale of the Canada property. He's requested today's meeting to discuss potentially restructuring the executor arrangement. Restructuring the executor arrangement. That's a very polished way to say, strip your sister of her legal authority and hand it to me instead. I looked at my brother. He had our mother's eyes and our father's appetite for other people's things. He was wearing a blazer I didn't recognize, new, expensive. I made a note of it. Go ahead, I said. I'd like to hear everything. He blinked. He'd expected something else from me. A defensive outburst, maybe. Tears. Something he could point to and say, see how unstable she is? Instead, I folded my hands on the table and waited, and the silence I left him stretched out in a way that made his lawyer shift in his seat. This is something they don't tell you about dealing with someone who runs on other people's reactions. The moment you stop giving them the reaction, they start to panic. Quietly, invisibly. But you can see it if you know where to look. My brother's jaw tightened. He opened his folder. Let me tell you something about the 14 months between my mother's death and that conference room. Because that's where the real story lives. My mother died in October. Ovarian cancer, stage 4, diagnosed in March, gone by Thanksgiving. She was 61. She had a small house in Canada that she'd owned outright since 2009, a modest RRSP, a TFSA, and a GIC she'd rolled over every 5 years since 1998. She was not a wealthy woman, but she was a careful one. She had named me executor of her estate, because her words. In the letter she left with the will, you're the one who reads the fine print. My brother didn't know about the letter. He thought he'd been passed over for executor, because our mother was confused at the end, that I had influenced her, that the whole thing was suspect. He started saying this at the reception after her funeral. I heard him in the kitchen while I was wrapping up the leftover butter tarts no one had touched. I didn't confront him. I went home, fed my cat, and started reading. I read the Estates Act. I read the Succession Law Reform Act. I called the estate lawyer my mother had used for 20 years. Not Mr. Cassidy, who was my brother's lawyer, but a woman named Ms. Boudreau, who had an office above a dry cleaner in Orleans and who had known my mother since before I was born. She told me to document everything, and trust no one who stood to inherit. I documented everything. My brother started slowly. A request here, a suggestion there. Could he take the piano? Could he be reimbursed for the expenses he'd incurred driving to appointments during Mom's illness? The receipts he submitted were for gas, yes, but also for 2 dinners at a steakhouse in Barhaven, and a hotel stay in Ottawa when he lived 40 minutes away. I paid the gas. I noted the rest. Then the real pressure started. He wanted to be named co-executor. He wanted access to the estate account just to check. He called me erratic. He told our aunt I had been acting paranoid since Mom died and that he was worried. He started copying my aunt on emails about the estate, framing his escalating demands as concern for the family. I watched every move and said very little. Here's what I knew that he didn't know I knew. 3 months after our mother's diagnosis, my brother had gone to her with a loan request. $50,000. He'd had a business. A franchise location of a sandwich shop out near Stittsville. That was hemorrhaging money. My mother had given it to him from her line of credit because she was my mother, and that's what she did. She told me about it quietly, 2 weeks before she died. Don't let him pretend it was a gift, she said. I was holding her hand, and she was looking at the ceiling, and her voice was very calm. It was a loan. I have the paperwork. I found the paperwork. I found it in the accordion folder she kept in the hall closet behind the extra towels, which is exactly where she said it would be. The loan had a repayment schedule. My brother had made 2 payments. Then our mother got sick and the payment stopped, and no one mentioned it again. By my calculation, with the interest rate she'd noted on the agreement, Modest, 3%, because she was our mother and not a bank. He owed the estate just under $47,000. He had never disclosed this loan to Mr. Cassidy. He had never mentioned it in any email. He had certainly never mentioned it to our aunt, who sat in that conference room dabbing at her eye and believing, sincerely, that I was the one who had been hiding things. But here is the part that required patience. Here is the part I am still proud of, even now, even knowing what it cost me. My mother's Canada house sold in January. It took 3 months to close. The proceeds after legal fees and the mortgage she'd refinanced in 2018 came to $312,000. That money sat in the estate account. I had signing authority. My brother had no access. He wanted that money. Every instinct he had was pointed at that $312,000 like a compass pointing north. So I let him think he had a path to it. I told him, in a carefully worded email, that I was overwhelmed with the complexity of managing the estate, and that I was open to discussing the executor arrangement. I used hedging language. I let myself sound uncertain. I watched him accelerate. He brought in Mr. Cassidy. He brought in our aunt. He drafted a proposal to have me removed as executor on the grounds of mismanagement, citing the estate's unexplained holding pattern, and my failure to distribute assets in a timely manner. He sent this proposal to the Law Society of Ontario. Not as a formal complaint yet, but as an inquiry, a shot across the bow. And then he called a family meeting. The meeting in that conference room. The meeting where he said I had been lying to everyone. What he didn't know was that I had already met with Ms. Boudreau 3 times in the 2 weeks before. What he didn't know was that Ms. Boudreau had reviewed the loan agreement, the estate account records, the emails my brother had sent, an inquiry letter he'd filed with the Law Society. What he didn't know was that Ms. Boudreau had quietly reached out to a colleague at the CRA, because the sandwich franchise my brother had been running had some interesting discrepancies in its reported income that had nothing to do with my mother's estate, and everything to do with why he needed $50,000 in cash in a hurry. I wasn't overwhelmed. I had been building a file. My brother finished his presentation. He had printed documents, he had highlighted sections. He talked for 11 minutes. I counted. He painted a picture of a grieving, unstable sister who had let an estate stagnate out of incompetence, who had failed her duty as executor, who needed to be relieved of a responsibility she clearly couldn't handle. My aunt reached over and touched his hand when he finished, like he had done something brave. Mr. Cassidy looked at me over his reading glasses. Do you have a response to these concerns? I picked up my manila folder. I have a few things, I said. I placed the first document on the table, the loan agreement. My mother's handwriting on the top line, my brother's signature at the bottom, dated April 14th of the year she was diagnosed. This is a promissory note, I said, for $50,000, signed by my brother, payable to my mother's estate. It was never disclosed during probate. Under Ontario estate law, undisclosed debts to a deceased's estate must be repaid before any distribution to beneficiaries. My brother is a beneficiary. This debt reduces his share of the estate by $47,200 including interest. The room went very quiet. My aunt stopped dabbing her eye. My brother's wife, behind him, made a small sound. Not quite a word. That's not, my brother started. Page 2, I said, and placed the next document. These are the estate account statements for the past 14 months. You'll see that the account has been actively managed. The holdings haven't been sitting idle. They were moved into a high-interest savings vehicle at EQ Bank in February, which has been generating returns while we wait for the estate to clear probate fully. The estate has actually grown by approximately $8,400 since January. There is no mismanagement. There is a strategy. Mr. Cassidy picked up the bank statements. His expression shifted in a way I found satisfying. Page 3. I set down a printed email thread. These are the emails my brother sent to our aunt over the past 8 months, framing his attempt to remove me as executor as a wellness concern for the family. I've cross-referenced the dates with his communications to Mr. Cassidy. You'll notice they escalate immediately following each of my refusals to grant him informal access to the estate account. The pattern is consistent. My brother pushed back from the table slightly. Not enough to stand, just enough to create distance. I want to be clear, I said, and I looked at my aunt, because she was the one in that room who had genuinely loved my mother and who deserved the truth. I have not been hiding money. I have been protecting it. There is a difference. And the reason I allowed this meeting to happen, the reason I didn't simply file a counter-complaint with the Law Society 2 weeks ago when I had the grounds to do so, is because I wanted everyone in this room to understand exactly what has been happening, not just to me, but to Mom's estate, to what she spent 40 years building. My aunt set her tissue down. My brother said, "You can't prove intent." Page 4, I said. I had debated this one. It was the sharpest edge. But Ms. Boudreau had been clear. If I had it, I should use it. It was a printed summary from the C inquiry. Not a formal notice. That would come later. But documentation that a review had been initiated into the business income reported by the franchise location my brother had operated between 2019 and 2022. There were discrepancies, significant ones. The kind that made it very inadvisable for someone to draw attention to themselves by filing bad faith complaints about an estate executor. I didn't file this, I told him. I didn't have to. You drew enough attention to yourself by copying a Law Society inquiry letter to 3 people, one of whom forwarded it to someone who knew someone. I paused. You should maybe think about who you copied. My brother's face did something I had never seen it do in 31 years of being his sister. It collapsed. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies. Just a slow, quiet subsidence, like a building settling wrong. He looked for a moment like a very tired man who had been running a very long con, and had just realized the Mark had known the whole time. I want to be done, I said. That's the honest answer to what I want. I want to administer Mom's estate correctly, distribute what's left after the loan repayment is accounted for, and then I want to never think about this again. I slid a single sheet across the table. A repayment agreement, drafted by Ms. Boudreau, $47,000, payable to the estate in installments over 18 months. Sign this, I said, and I won't pursue a formal complaint about the non-disclosure. You'll still receive your share of the estate, minus what you owe. It'll take longer because of the installment schedule, but you'll get it. Mr. Cassidy looked at my brother. My brother looked at the document. His wife put a hand on his shoulder and he shrugged it off. He picked up the pen. He signed. The meeting ended 12 minutes later. My aunt walked out without looking at my brother. She stopped at the door and turned back to me, and I thought she was going to say something complicated. Something about family and forgiveness and keeping the peace. Instead, she said, "Your mother knew." And then she left. I sat in the parking garage for a while afterward. Not crying, just sitting. There's a particular kind of tired that isn't about sleep. It's the tired you feel when you've been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and you've finally been allowed to set it down. The estate cleared 4 months later. The distribution went through without incident. My brother made his first installment payment on time. He has not called me since the conference room. I have not called him. I sold my mother's piano to a music teacher in Nepean, who has 3 kids and wanted something they could actually use. She paid me $800 and sent me a photo of her youngest playing it 2 weeks later. I put the photo on my fridge. The cat is fine. The transit pass is still in my coat pocket. Some people will tell you that family is everything, and maybe that's true for some families. But I think what my mother actually meant, when she wrote that I was the one who reads the fine print, was this. Love is not the same thing as trust. You can love someone and still know exactly what they are. You can grieve someone and still protect what they left behind. She built something careful and small and real over 40 years. I was not going to let it disappear, because I was too polite to open a folder. Peace isn't given. You build it, quietly, document by document, while everyone else is waiting for you to fall apart.